Looking now at the bones of the humerus, the radius and the ulna. Starting with the humerus, we've been introduced to part of the humerus already. It's classified as a long bone, and at the top end the humerus articulates with the scapula to form the glenohumeral joint. So up here we can see the head of the humerus, and like all good heads, it sits on the anatomical neck of the humerus. There's the lesser tubercle anteriorly with the greater tubercle laterally and the intertubercular sulcus in between. This is the shaft of the humerus, and down here we have things like the deltoid tuberosity. Around the back we've got the radial groove for the passage of the radial nerve. Down at the lower end, however, we have additional structures that we need to consider. This part down here forms the articulation with the radius and the ulna to form the elbow joint. Here at the lower end we can see that the humerus looks like it flares out into two condyles, very much like the femur does. But when we look at the two condyloid parts, we have on one side we have this pulley-shaped section known as the trochlea, and next to that we have what looks like a little ball anteriorly and inferiorly known as the capitulum. The trochlea articulates with the upper end of the ulna, the capitulum articulates with the radius. Over here we've got the medial epicondyle and the lateral epicondyle, which are clearly palpable points and are points of reference in particular for the ligaments of the elbow joint themselves. Above the trochlea and above the radius anteriorly here, we see a hollow, and this is known as the coronoid fossa above the trochlea. Above the capitulum is a little hollow here known as the radial fossa. When we turn the humerus around and look at the lower end at the back, we see another hollow. This is known as the olecranon fossa. The function of these fossae is to allow components of the radius and ulna to slot into the humerus when the elbow is either in full flexion for the anterior fossae or full extension for the posterior fossae. When we move down to the forearm, we have two bones that lie parallel to each other. There's the ulna that is quite solidly fixed. It articulates up here with the trochlea, and that's the medial bone. And on the lateral side, we have the radius. Both are classified as long bones, and both have the typical characteristics of a long bone, i.e. they have expanded epiphyses at both ends, and they have a diaphysis, a shaft that runs down the middle. When we start off looking at the ulna, here is the ulna on the medial side. When we look at the top end of the ulna, points to note in particular are this great big hook that we have at the top end of the ulna. Okay, now the hook itself is made up of two processes. The posterior process is known as the olecranon process. The anterior process is known as the coronoid process. And together they form a notch called the trochlea notch that articulates with the trochlea on the lower end of the humerus itself. When we move down to the bottom end of the ulna, points to note are over here we've got the ulna on the medial side, so this would be the thumb on this side here. We have the head of the ulna sits at the bottom end, and next to that there is a little process, a little spike of bone called the styloid process of the ulna. And these are, the styloid process is for the attachment of the ligaments of the wrist in particular. There will be other points to note on the ulna, but we'll do those as we come to look at the muscles and joints themselves. When we look at the radius is the lateral bone. So over here we've got the radius, and we go to the top end of the radius, and what we see first of all, we see this flattened disc. When we actually see, look at this top end of the radius, it looks like somebody's balanced a tree ball mint on the top of the radius itself. This is known as the head of the radius, and this articulates with that ball-shaped structure, the capitulum, on the lower end of the humerus. All heads sit on a neck, so this is the anatomical neck of the radius, and at the end of the anatomical neck we've got this huge lump here known as the radial tuberosity, and that is for the attachment of biceps brachii. The radius then has a shaft, and when we get down to the bottom end of the radius, here we've got a posterior view of the lower end of the radius here. It's the larger of the two ends, it's the far more stable of the two ends, and the points to note there is a tubercle on the dorsum, on the posterior aspect of the radius, known as the dorsal tubercle. There is a process again which is known as the styloid process of the radius, and again that's for the ligaments of the wrist joint. There is an articular surface down here which articulates with scaphoid and lunate in particular to form the carpal joint. But we'll do that later on again when we look at the wrist.